The barges went out in the dark, and nobody watched them tip. Tons of oyster shells, scraped from restaurant plates, hauled out of processing plants. The leftovers of 10,000 dinners, sliding off the edge into the Gulf of Mexico. No precision. No plan beyond getting rid of them. Between 2007 and 2024, 500,000 tons hit the seafloor off Florida's coast. Scientists filed the permits. Fishermen filed complaints. Critics called it reckless dumping dressed up as conservation, a way to make garbage sound like science. Even the researchers who designed the program quietly braced for the data to prove everyone right. The seafloor they were dropping shells onto was dead. Oxygen-starved sediment, the kind of bottom that takes decades to recover on its own, if it recovers at all. What happened next wasn't in any of their models. The bottom didn't just improve, it transformed. Faster, denser, and stranger than anything the projections had forecast. But what actually happened down there, in the dark, after 500,000 tons of shell landed on that dead ground? That's the part that's still making scientists revise their assumptions about what dying ocean bottom can become. To understand what those shells landed on, you have to go back, not to 2007, not even to the decade before it. You have to go back far enough to see what the Gulf Coast once was, and trace the long, quiet line of decisions that unmade it. Florida's oyster reefs were never small. At their peak, they formed sprawling underwater ridges stretching for miles through the estuaries and shallow Gulf waters. Living architecture that filtered billions of gallons of water, anchored sediment, and fed every layer of the food chain above them. Fishermen who worked those grounds in the mid-20th century described reefs thick enough to scrape a hole. The shells built on themselves generation after generation, some mounds growing for thousands of years. Then came the pressure, over-harvesting through the post-war decades. Freshwater runoff from agricultural expansion flooding the estuaries with nutrients, choking out the oxygen oysters need to spawn. Coastal development paving over the wetlands that once buffered those same reefs from storm surge and pollution. Each pressure alone might have been manageable. Together, they compounded, and nobody with the authority to stop any one of them ever did. By the early 2000s, some historic reef beds had shed more than 90% of their live oyster cover. Not from a single disaster, not from a hurricane or a spill, from decades of attrition so gradual it was easy to explain away each year as just a little worse than the last. The reefs didn't die dramatically, they quietly disappeared while the paperwork caught up, which raises a question that the shell dumping program would eventually have to answer. If the collapse took that long and ran that deep, could anything actually reverse it? And what would reversal even look like? To answer that, whether reversal is even possible, you first have to understand what you're trying to reverse. And most people, if they're honest, have never really thought about what an oyster reef is. Not what it looks like, what it does. An oyster reef isn't decoration, it's infrastructure. It's one of the most functionally complex structures a shallow coastal ecosystem can produce, and it earns that status in several ways at once. Start with filtration. A single adult oyster filters up to 50 gallons of water every day, pulling out suspended sediment, excess nutrients, algae. A thriving reef, spread across a city block of Gulf floor, is essentially a living water treatment plant running around the clock, for free, powered by nothing but the current. The water clarity that once made Florida's coastal shallows famous wasn't an accident of geography. It was in large part the reefs doing their job. Then there's habitat. The reef's three-dimensional surface, ridges, crevices, stacked shell on shell, creates shelter for juvenile fish, blue crabs, shrimp, worms, barnacles. Remove the reef and you don't just lose the oysters, you lose the architecture that dozens of other species depend on. Which makes the obvious question sharp. If reefs do all of that, why is rebuilding them so hard? The answer starts with understanding exactly why Florida's Gulf reefs collapse so completely in the first place, and the reasons run deeper than overharvesting alone. The collapse wasn't just about overharvesting, it was about what overharvesting left behind, or rather what it took away. When a reef is dredged or raked flat, the shell matrix goes with it. And without shell, the next generation of oysters has nowhere to land. That's the trap. It's not a resource problem, it's a substrate problem. Here's what makes it almost elegant in its cruelty. Oyster larvae don't settle randomly. They're chemically specific. A larva drifting in the water column can actually detect the smell of calcium carbonate, the compound in oyster shell, and actively swim toward it. It's not instinct in the vague sense. It's a molecular signal, a homing cue baked into the animal's biology. Dead shell smells like home. Without it, the larvae drift. They lose the signal. They die before they ever touch bottom. This is why throwing rocks, concrete rubble, even artificial reef modules at the problem doesn't fully work. The substrate has to be chemically right, not just physically hard. Shell is the trigger. There's no clean substitute, which lands us at the obvious problem. If shell is the only substrate that reliably works, that larvae will actually respond to, you need an enormous amount of it to rebuild a reef system at any meaningful scale. And natural shell beds in Florida had been depleted alongside the reefs themselves. So where exactly do you get 500,000 tons of it? The answer was sitting in dumpsters. Literally. Behind every oyster bar, every seafood shack, every processing plant along the Florida coast, spent shell was piling up, shucked clean, rinsed off, and hauled to the curb. Florida's shellfish industry was discarding millions of pounds of it every single year, and the vast majority of it was going straight to landfill, not recycled, not repurposed, buried. The exact material a collapsed reef system was chemically starving for, and the industry was throwing it away by the truckload. That's not a metaphor. That is what was happening. Restaurants alone in some Gulf Coast counties were generating enough spent shell annually to fill several shipping containers a week, and it had nowhere to go because nobody had built the infrastructure to move it anywhere useful. So the 500,000 ton problem and the landfill overflow problem were sitting 20 miles apart from each other, completely unconnected. The question that started to take shape in the early 2000s was almost embarrassingly simple. What if you just collected it? What if the waste stream from one industry was exactly the raw material another ecosystem desperately needed? Could recycling restaurant shell actually rebuild something offshore? That idea sounds obvious in retrospect. It was not obvious at the time. So, in the early 2000s, the Shell Recycling Alliance and Florida Sea Grant started building the infrastructure to do exactly that. Collection bins went into restaurants. Pickup routes got mapped. Agreements got signed with processors and seafood distributors who had been paying to haul shell to the landfill and were understandably relieved to have another option. On paper, it looked like a clean solution. In practice, almost nobody thought it would actually work. The logistics were harder than they sounded. Shell is heavy, it smells, it requires curing time before it can go back in the water, and coordinating volunteers, trucking, and storage across dozens of collection sites along a coastline is exactly the kind of operation that tends to collapse under its own weight. Program coordinators later described those early years as running on optimism and very little else. And even the scientists who designed the offshore restoration component, the part where the collected shell would actually be deployed to rebuild reef substrate, were quietly tempering their expectations. The conventional wisdom in marine restoration at the time was blunt. Reef recovery at the scale Florida needed simply took too long to matter within any reasonable funding window. You might plant the seed of a reef and wait decades to see results. Prepare for small numbers, they told each other. Prepare for a slow, incremental story. What nobody had prepared for was what the early monitoring data actually showed once that shell hit the water. The first barge loads went in starting around 2007. Cured shell, collected from restaurants and processors along the Gulf Coast, offloaded at designated sites over soft seafloor that had not supported a functioning oyster reef in years, in some cases, decades. The teams marked the coordinates, noted the depths, and sent divers down to establish baselines. What they documented was predictably bleak. Bare substrate, low oxygen at the bottom layer, almost no juvenile oyster presence. Exactly what everyone expected. Then, the monitoring began in earnest, and something went sideways, in the best possible way. Within months of the first deployments, divers reported juvenile oysters settling on the new shell at densities the team had not seen on any natural reef remnant they had surveyed. Not a few. Not a modest uptick the statisticians would have to squint at. Dense carpets of spat on a substrate that, weeks earlier, had been dead bottom. The scientists did what scientists do when a result looks too clean. They questioned it. Settlement spikes happen. A favorable current, an unusually productive spawning season, a statistical fluke. Any of these could explain a short burst of recruitment that would thin out and disappear before the next dive. The real question wasn't whether the oysters had arrived. It was whether they would stay. They stayed. 6 months in, the spat hadn't thinned. A year in, juvenile oysters were maturing into adults, building structure on top of structure. The shell pile was becoming a reef in the biological sense, not just the geometric one. That answered the first question. But by the time divers confirmed the oysters were holding, a second question had already arrived, and it was stranger than the first. The species list was wrong. Not wrong as in incomplete. Wrong as in nobody had put half of these animals on it because nobody thought they'd be there yet. Researchers cataloged more than 100 distinct species on restored shell sites within 3 years of deployment. Fish, crabs, worms, sponges, invertebrates with no obvious reason to appear on what had been bare mud a single season earlier. 100 species. On substrate that, not long before, supported almost nothing. That number stopped people, because a hard surface alone doesn't explain it. Oyster shell is calcium carbonate in texture. It offers grip, crevice, relief from a flat, featureless bottom. But the cascade of life that followed the shell went well beyond what a hard surface recruits. Something else was happening down there. The shell wasn't just a foundation, it was doing something, changing the local environment in ways that made it hospitable to animals that had no business showing up this fast. What that something was would take more dives, more data, and more than a little rethinking of what restoration was actually capable of. The hard surface explained the grip. It didn't explain the crowd. 100 species in 3 years, on what had been bare mud. That math didn't work on texture alone. So researchers started looking at what the shell was releasing, not just what it was providing. And what they found was chemistry. Calcium carbonate, which is what oyster shell is made of, doesn't just sit there. It dissolves, slowly, incrementally, over years. And as it does, it releases carbonate ions into the surrounding water. Carbonate ions are alkaline. They raise pH, and in a narrow band of water just above the reef, that's exactly what was happening. The aged shell was pushing local pH upward, degree by fraction of a degree, creating a chemical microclimate measurably different from the water column 10 meters away. That matters more than it sounds. Larval settlement, the moment a free-swimming larva commits to a surface and starts building its body, is exquisitely sensitive to pH. Slightly more alkaline water makes calcification easier, survival rates higher, the window for successful settlement wider. The shells weren't just offering structure. They were softening the chemistry of arrival. And that raised a harder question. If the shells were changing the water above them, and that change was making new settlers more likely to survive, and those new settlers were adding more shell, then the restoration wasn't just building a reef. It might have been building a system that was building itself. That question, whether the restoration was accelerating itself, turned out to be testable. Researchers had been measuring reef elevation from the beginning. Not just species counts, not just water chemistry, but the physical height of the shell mound itself, surveyed repeatedly at fixed points. When they ran the numbers against their original models, the gap was hard to explain away. Reef elevation at several monitored sites was rising at roughly 3 times the projected rate, not 10% above forecast, 3 times. The models had assumed a relatively passive accumulation, shells settling, compressing, building slowly. What was actually happening was faster, denser, and structurally more complex. New oysters were filtering the water. Clearer water let light penetrate deeper. More larvae found surfaces and settled. Those settlers calcified, added mass, died, and left their shells as new substrate, which dissolved incrementally, raised local pH, and made the next generation of settlers more likely to survive. Each turn of the cycle was amplifying the one before it. The reef wasn't just growing. It was growing the conditions that made it grow. But that raised a question that data couldn't yet answer. A feedback loop that accelerates doesn't accelerate forever. Something slows it, caps it, or reverses it. And if this reef was moving 3 times faster than anyone predicted going up, the researchers had to ask what would happen when it stopped. The answer, as it turned out, wasn't theoretical. The Gulf handed researchers a ceiling test they never asked for. In April 2010, the Deepwater Horizon wellhead failed roughly 40 miles offshore, and over the next 87 days, it released nearly 5 million barrels of crude into the Gulf of Mexico. Some of the restored reef sites that had been accumulating shell mass, recruiting larvae, and tightening their feedback loops were directly in the path of what followed: the oil, the dispersants, and the oxygen crash that came with both. These were sites in a critical growth window. The feedback cycle was running, and then it wasn't. What came next became, entirely by accident, one of the most useful datasets the restoration program would ever produce. Because the researchers had been measuring everything: elevation, recruitment rates, water chemistry, species composition. Before the spill, they could now measure the same things after. They had a before and after that no one had designed and no one would have chosen. But compared to what? Natural reef remnants in the same region took the same hit. And how the restored sites fared against those remnants, whether the built structure held, collapsed, or recovered faster, was exactly the kind of test that would reveal whether this reef had a ceiling, or something worse than a ceiling. The spill hit the restored sites hard. Oxygen levels crashed, larvae died mid-settlement, and the water chemistry that had been driving recruitment went toxic for weeks. On paper, those sites should have collapsed back toward bare substrate. The feedback loop interrupted. The accumulated shell mass smothered under a layer of crude and dispersant residue. Critics who had questioned the program from the start had their moment. The ocean had just handed the restoration effort the stress test they always said it couldn't survive. But the data came back wrong. Wrong for the critics, at least. Natural reef remnants in the same region, hit by the same spill, showed slower recovery across nearly every metric the researchers tracked. Larval recruitment rates, return of filter-feeding species, water column clarity above the reef. The restored shell sites, particularly the ones that had accumulated the highest oyster density before the spill, bounced back measurably faster. Not dramatically faster in every case, but consistently, statistically, across multiple sites, the pattern held. What that suggested was something the program hadn't set out to prove. Density wasn't just a sign that a reef was healthy, it was part of what made a reef survivable. The thicker the shell matrix, the more structural redundancy it held against a disruption that wiped the surface clean. The mass itself was insurance, which raises a harder question. If density is a resilience factor and not just an outcome, then the way you build a reef in the first place, how much shell, how concentrated, how fast you push toward that critical mass, stops being just a logistics question. It becomes a design question. And that question doesn't have a clean answer yet. That design question has a second dimension the reef building data alone doesn't capture. Because density as a resilience factor isn't only about whether the reef survives, it's about what the reef protects behind it. Oyster reefs don't just create habitat. They interrupt water. A healthy reef, rising even a meter off the seafloor, creates friction against incoming wave energy, slowing it, scattering it, bleeding off its force before it reaches a shoreline. Studies on wave attenuation show that a 1-meter-high oyster reef can reduce incoming wave energy by up to 70%. That's not a marginal effect. A concrete seawall delivering equivalent protection costs millions of dollars per mile to build and more to maintain. The reef, once established, builds and maintains itself. Florida has roughly 1,350 miles of coastline. It sits in the direct path of Atlantic hurricanes and Gulf storm systems. The arithmetic of what functional reef coverage would mean for coastal exposure is not a small number, which raises a question that isn't really a scientific question at all. If restored oyster reefs can provide wave attenuation worth millions of dollars per mile, why isn't that calculus driving government funding at a scale that matches the problem? Part of the answer is that infrastructure budgets were built for concrete. Part of it is that living systems are harder to guarantee on a contract timeline. And part of it is that the density data, the finding that reef structure is a design input, not just an outcome, is recent enough that the policy world hasn't caught up to it yet. And that gap between what the science now shows and what the funding reflects is, in its own way, a data point. By 2024, the total public and private investment in Florida's shell recycling and reef restoration program across nearly 2 decades of operation amounted to a fraction of what a single mile of conventional seawall costs to build. 1 mile. Concrete and rebar. And yet the restored acreage that program produced dwarfed what any equivalent length of hard infrastructure could have achieved, with wave attenuation, filtration, and habitat complexity running continuously, without maintenance contracts, without replacement cycles. So why isn't every Gulf state running a version of this program at 10 times the scale? Why isn't this the default coastal resilience strategy for low-lying shorelines anywhere in the world where oysters can survive? The honest answer is three things stacked on top of each other. Governments fund what they can guarantee on a fixed timeline to a fixed specification. Living systems don't sign contracts. A seawall delivers a guaranteed elevation and a certified load rating. A reef delivers a probability distribution that widens the further out you project. Budget offices don't have a line item for that. Insurance actuaries don't have a table for it. And the engineers who sign off on coastal protection permits were trained on materials, not organisms. But Florida ran the experiment anyway, and what it produced raises a harder question: whether a single state seafood waste program accidentally became a blueprint that the rest of the coastline hasn't read yet. Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas have all been watching. Florida's data has been circulating through coastal management offices for the better part of a decade, and the pattern of interest is not subtle. These are states with their own dying oyster fisheries, their own storm-battered coastlines, their own seafood processing plants generating the same shell waste Florida was hauling to landfills before 2007. The raw material exists. The biological logic transfers. The question everyone is asking in those offices is whether the model does too. And the answer is sharper than it first appears, because the single biggest constraint on replication isn't funding, and it isn't a shortage of shells. It is the law. In a handful of jurisdictions, deploying shell mass offshore still triggers the regulatory definition of ocean dumping, the same classification that governs industrial waste disposal, same permit category, same evidentiary burden, same presumption of harm. Florida navigated that framework over years of negotiation. Other states are looking at that timeline and doing the math against their own political cycles. The irony is almost complete. The material is biologically productive. The science is documented, and the barrier is a legal definition written before anyone ran this experiment. Whether that definition can be changed, and who has the standing to change it, whether it's state environmental agencies, federal regulators, or a coordinated push across multiple coastlines at once, is now the live question. Florida proved the biology works. The rest of the coast is staring at the paperwork. That paperwork problem had a partial answer arrive quietly in 2021. And almost no one outside the restoration community caught it. The EPA issued guidance that began formally distinguishing beneficial use of shell material from conventional ocean dumping. Not a repeal of the old framework, more like a crack in the wall. New permitting pathways opened. The evidentiary burden shifted slightly. States that had been staring at Florida's timeline and doing the math against their own political cycles suddenly had a different set of numbers to work with. The classification that had treated oyster shells and industrial discharge as the same category of problem began slowly to come apart. That is how regulatory change usually happens. Not a single decisive ruling, but a guidance document, a footnote, a quiet administrative distinction that practitioners notice before anyone else does. The question of who changes the definition and how is no longer entirely unanswered. Federal regulators moved first. State agencies are now in the position of deciding how aggressively to follow, and coordinated pressure across multiple coastlines is building in a way it wasn't 5 years ago. The wall is not gone, but it has a door in it now, which means the real question has shifted. With the legal barrier clearing, what does the next phase of Gulf Reef restoration actually look like, in terms of scale, speed, and ambition? The door in the wall matters. But while regulators were debating classification language, something was happening on the seafloor that had nothing to do with paperwork. The reefs were not waiting. Acoustic mapping surveys completed in 2022 and 2023 revealed something the program's designers had not anticipated and, frankly, had not designed for. The shell mound footprints had expanded laterally beyond the original dump coordinates, not by a small margin. The reefs were pulling in shell material from the surrounding seafloor, recruiting it, incorporating it, and self-propagating in ways the original blueprints never modeled. The structure was growing itself. That is a different category of outcome than a restoration project that holds steady. A reef that actively expands its own footprint changes the math on every projection, on how much coastline a single program can protect, on how many shells you actually need to achieve a given acreage, on what the ceiling is. The data is still arriving. Some of the 2023 survey zones had not been fully analyzed by early 2024. Researchers are still working out what the lateral expansion rate actually means at scale. What they have confirmed is that the reefs formed by the Shell program are not static. They are, in some measurable sense, alive in a way that surprises people who study reef dynamics for a living, which opens a question that the original program never had to answer. What does a self-propagating reef actually become? And is what formed out there still an oyster reef, or something else entirely? What formed out there is still an oyster reef, but the word undersells it. It is an oyster reef that is building itself, expanding its own footprint, and doing it without any of the conditions marine biologists typically list as prerequisites for rapid reef recovery. No pristine water chemistry, no carefully staged reintroduction of broodstock, no engineered substrate placed with millimeter-level precision, just shells, dropped from barges in roughly the right coordinates. And that turns out to be the answer, which is also the embarrassing part. Scientists spent years debating the methodology, questioning the rigor, asking whether leftover seafood shells could actually function as viable substrate. The larvae did not wait for the conclusion of that debate. They need one thing: surface. Not sophisticated surface, not treated surface, just calcium carbonate they can lock onto, and enough of it stacked in proximity that the current delivers them to it. The barges gave them exactly that, 500,000 tons of exactly that. What the models missed was how little the ocean actually requires when you remove the bottleneck. The structure grew faster than any projection because the projection assumed the ocean was more fragile than it is. It is not fragile, it is patient. Give it the right raw material and it does not recover slowly. It recovers the moment the conditions exist, which means every coastline losing its reefs right now may be one barge load away from the same answer.